This morning's session we will call Review of the 8 Cardinal Rules. So yesterday we talked about so many things related to buckskin sewing, right? We went over hides and the structure of hides, and can anyone give me a quick review of what animal skin is built of?
Protein fibers.
Yeah, thank you. Long protein fibers going every which way and moving back and forth past one another in a living animal and stuck to one another in chrome tan hides and bark tan hides and sliding past one another lubricated by the brains of the animal in brain tan buckskin, right? So that's why brain tan has more give and stretch and movement and life to it than other leathers. Additionally, because it still has the same width that it had as the skin of a living animal, which was thickest where?
And the rumps and the neck, right?
Yeah, so first the neck, right, because that's the first place where predators would attack, then the rumps, because that's the place that other smaller predators tend to attack, and then the spine, because that's where they go under barbed wire fences and through blackberry brambles and whatnot. So in those orders, and then thinner and thinner as we get towards the bellies, right? So what I have today to start off is kind of a summary of the most important things from all of that mess of information that we covered yesterday for you guys to write in your notebooks or just lodge in your head. And I actually have a little handout with all of this. But I have what I call, oh, this actually says 7, I was saying 8, the 7 cardinal rules of buckskin. So the first one is what we talked about in terms of the variability between and within different hides, which is to let the hide dictate the project, right? So buckskin, it has so much energy and character, and every hide is different. So really feeling that hide and letting the hide tell you what it would be best suited for, rather than trying to force a hide to be what you're not, what it isn't as well suited for. And we saw this with Christy's tank top, where she used a pretty darn thick hide to make a tank top, right? Which is a little trickier, because usually you're going to be wearing it in warm weather and you don't want it to be thick hides. And you also want it to take a shape to your body. So the thinner it is, the more it's going to move when you move and take more of a set to your body. So thicker hides are more ideal for things that are looser and less fitted. And then the second cardinal rule is designing for the long term, right? We talked about that, where because buckskin moves and stretches and takes a set to your body, if you make it so that it fits you just right the first time you ever put it on, it's going to end up stretched out and over big. Because as you move in it and it's subjected to the forces of your body, it's going to get pulled and stretched. So better to make it a little bit snug to start with, and then let it wear in to the size that you want it to be. So this also goes along with binding your edges, which we will get to. So the third cardinal rule is the one that we kind of started out talking about, be the deer, right? So that's where we talked about keeping the spine of the hide in line with your spine, or parts of your body where you want the toughness and resiliency, using the tough, resilient parts of the deer. So for pants, the deer's rump on your rump, the rump in the crotch of your pants, because that's where you're going to have a lot of force. The yoke of a jacket being in that rump section of hide, which is really thick and tough. So just really keeping in mind the lay of the deer and the lay of your body. The fourth rule is stitch angle, right? We talked about the importance of the ways the stitches lie in relation to the seam. So does anyone remember the 2 major categories of stitches?
There was the crosses and then the vertical, like the ones that go in the straight line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of opposite of vertical. But so if this is the line of the seam, you've got stitches that go parallel to that seam, like the running stitch is the classic one, and you've got stitches that go diagonal to the seam. Mm-hmm. So those are the 2 basic categories. And so those are the different stitches, and then there's also different types of seams, right? There's plain seam, overlapping seam, and butted seam. And butted seams, you can only sew with diagonal stitches, right? Like this. Because parallel seams, parallel stitches wouldn't ever get to the other piece. So we talked about the difference between those. So rule number 4, be mindful of your stitch angle, is just use parallel stitches anywhere you want to be controlling for stretch or where you have distinct shaping and you really want it to hold its shape. And use diagonal stitches on summer wear or clothing that you want to have breathe and that you want to have be more fluid and move and have the seams not be really controlling and binding.
Would that be the same with the X stitch? Because like it is a crossing stitch, but like it seems binding.
Great question. Okay, yes, so there are two different ways to sew the X stitch, and we have examples in two different garments sitting here. So this is a fancy dress, and it's nicely fitted, so this is something that I don't want to have stretched. So if you look at it, it's X stitches, so that looks diagonal to the seam. But if you turn it inside out, it's parallel stitches. So again, sometimes there are stitches that look diagonal, but when you turn them inside out, they parallel on one side. So if they're parallel on either side, they act like a parallel seam, so they're going to be binding. Versus this tank top, which again is a lightweight summer tank top, and this also has the X stitch. Okay, X is here, but on the back side, it's X's there too. And look how much stretch this has. I can stretch it quite a bit lengthwise and across. So that's the difference between the parallel X stitch and the diagonal X stitch. Makes a huge difference. And this is a great example of two different tank tops sewn with two different types of seams and stitches. So both have the kind of shaping like I have on the bodice of this tank top. I call this differential seams, where the seams are a different length and a different shape. So this is a curved panel, and this has a panel with a straight line that has just a little bit of angle to it. And that's what gives bodice shaping, or one of the things you can do for bodice shaping. So this tank top started that same curve, and you can see it's still got some of that curve to it, but it stretches out a lot and it loses some of that. So this is a little bit less fitted than it started out, versus this that I used the running stitch with really small stitches close together, and so this holds its shape a lot more, and you can see it doesn't stretch very much in either direction. So this holds shape a lot, and this same style is gonna be looser, stretchier, give more in different directions, and it's become more distorted over time. Let's see. Rule number 5 is keep your stitches small and your holes small. So that's, again, related to this. So you see these two tops, these are very small stitches for controlling shape and stretch. And these, there's a lot more space between the stitches. The stitches are much larger. So we talked about this in terms of having our seams maintain their integrity over the long term. The further apart the stitches are, the more the buckskin is able to stretch away from your thong, and it's not going to do its job of controlling stretch regardless of what kind of seam it is. So this is an example of an older shirt, or an older bag I've had for some time. This is probably at least 12 or 13 years old, and these seams, you can see if I stretch far enough, I actually pop the edges out of this. So this stretches a fair amount, even though it's a running stitch, but it's because my stitches are small, but there's a lot of space in between them. I could have fit probably at least 1 or 2 more stitches between every one like this, and then I wouldn't be having this gapping. Myron was talking about that with his pockets. He has one pair of shorts with a lot of space between the stitches, and he says his keys pop out through the bottom of his pocket. His next pair he did with the stitches much closer together and doesn't have that problem. So it makes a big functional difference. And then also, you want your holes to be small because you want them to really hold on to the thong, so that thong isn't sliding back and forth through your holes. Because even if your stitches are close together, but if your holes are really big and the thong isn't tight in those holes, then it's also not controlling your seam. So all of the different elements of the seams and stitches work together, and you really have to have all of the elements right to get the function that you want out of your seams. The last of the functional rules are bind any edges that you don't want to stretch. So with buckskin, sometimes it's really nice to leave the natural edge of the hide. So this was the tail area of the deer, and this is an edge that was already cut before the tanning process, so it got stretched and pulled maximally. So it doesn't stretch a whole lot more. This is a way that I can leave a natural edge on my hide and I don't have to bind it, and it's not going to stretch a lot. But anywhere that I have cut the hide after it was tanned, then those fibers weren't pulled maximally during the stretching process. They were held in place by the other hide during the stretching process. So now that they're cut, now they're kind of released and they can stretch a lot. So particularly neck and armholes, those are places where things tend to stretch a lot. Like neck hole really because you're pushing your head through it, so it's under all of this force and tension as you're putting it on. So very important that you bind all edges. And again, a lot of people want to work with buckskin the way they work with cloth. So they think, okay, I need to bind an edge. So what I do with cloth is I roll that edge and then I sew around it. The reason you do that with cloth is it unravels. Buckskin doesn't unravel. There's really no reason to fold your edges. All you're doing is making unnecessary bulk.
Could you, like, I know for one of my bags, I did roll the edge thinking I would give it, like, I think it was a pocket on the inside, and I thought it would give it, like, some sort of stability or, like, a bit more, I wanted the bulk in a sense.
Yeah,
I think.
where you want bulk, then it's no problem. And sometimes it's a nice thing to do where you really want to control stretch. So, let's see. There's a pair of pants here. So this is a pair of pants. Again, these are my one of my oldest garments here. So I make different choices now than I did when I was making these. But I did roll the edge of this because it does give a little bit more stretch resistance. So places where that's really important, like a waistband that the pants are hanging from, that's a good place to double it over. But it's also bulkier there. So when I make lighter weight pants, like these are a capri pant and these are shorts, I didn't do that because frankly, I feel this when I'm wearing them. It's a little uncomfortable right there. It's like this extra band pressing against my hip. I can feel it on my hip bones. So it's really, I find, a lot less ideal to have folded edges with buckskin, particularly with really thick hides. Thin hides, you can get away with it and not feel it as much. But anywhere, you know, like neck or armhole, that's the last place that you want extra bulk. It's uncomfortable and it makes this kind of bulgy. It's not attractive.
Yeah.
So yeah, I generally avoid it. And you don't need it because all you need is a simple line of running stitch. No need to fold over edges. Just running stitch is going to do the same effect. You just want to make sure that you're using a parallel stitch when you're trying to bind an edge. Don't make the mistake of the whip stitch, which goes around and around in a seam, because that's just going to make stretching worse. And it's the most common mistake I see in buckskin clothing is the use of the whip stitch, thinking that it will bind an edge. And then the 7th cardinal rule is gratitude. So just to be able to take a step back, when you're in your brain and in your hands and thinking about the buckskin, and just be grateful to the deer for providing this amazing medium, and don't forget that what we're doing here, it was facilitated by the deer and by the forest around us, and just whatever you make out of buckskin, it's still magical and beautiful to be able to wear the skin of this animal. So I have that as the final rule because I feel like that's the most important thing to keep in mind as an overarching principle as we're working with buckskin.